Was there a lost gospel named Q that early Christians used? And does this gospel unlock hidden clues about the early Christian movement? Many scholars would say yes, but I say not so fast. What's up everyone, welcome to the channel. Be sure to hit the subscribe button and smash the bell notification so that you don't miss future content. Today we're going to be dealing with the question of, did a lost gospel named Q ever exist? And should we be using that when we are trying to come up with historical information about the early Christian movement and about Jesus himself? I'm going to be giving evidence that there never was a Q. This is part 2 in a series on the Synoptic problem. Check out my other video on the Synoptic problem in which I argue that Mark was the first gospel that was written. In this video, I will be building off of what I argued for in the previous video. So in this video, I'll be assuming that Mark was the first gospel that was written and that Matthew and Luke were each using Mark when they were writing their gospels. But this video is about how we know that the lost gospel Q never actually existed. Many of you are probably wondering, what is Q? The gospel Q, or some people call it the Q source or the Q document. Basically, Q is the result of Markan priority. So what I argued for in my previous video, that Matthew and Luke each use Mark, that's Markan priority. So when scholars figured out that Mark was the first gospel that was written and that Matthew and Luke each used Mark, they also realized that Matthew and Luke share about 230 verses that are not in Mark. These are verses that Matthew and Luke have in common, sayings of Jesus and even occasional stories that they have in common, but they're clearly not getting from their Mark source. And so scholars hypothesized that there must have been another source that Matthew and Luke each used just like they used Mark. Scholars call this hypothetical source Q, which comes from the German word Quelle, which means source. Nowadays, many scholars think that Q is the earliest source in the Gospels, and that it is a lost gospel that gives us our most important information and most reliable information about Jesus. Importantly, if Q existed, it would mean that there is an early gospel that doesn't have Jesus' death and resurrection, meaning that maybe the resurrection wasn't all that important for some of the earliest Christians. Or maybe they didn't believe in it. It's obvious why the Q hypothesis is appealing to modern critical scholars who emphasize that early Christianity had a plurality of different views and doctrines. So when we're dealing with questions like, was there this hypothetical source called Q that Matthew and Luke each used, I think it's very important to keep a famous principle called Occam's razor in mind. Occam's razor is basically a principle that is used to see what is the starting likelihood of two different hypotheses. When you have two different hypotheses, before you actually look at the evidence, how do you determine which one starts off as being more probable than the other one? Occam's razor is the idea that when there are two competing theories that explain the data, the simplest one is more probably true. In other words, a theory with fewer hypotheticals, by which I mean unproven ideas, starts off with a higher probability than a theory that has more hypotheticals or unproven ideas. If a hypothesis can explain all of the data without appealing to unproven ideas, it is better than a hypothesis that appeals to lots of unproven ideas. This is what it means that the simplest explanation is the best. Of course, for a simple theory to be the best, it has to be able to explain all of the data just as well as a complex theory. So when we apply Occam's razor to Q, the question is how to explain the 230 verses that are in Matthew and Luke, but not in the Gospel of Mark. These verses are called the double tradition because they're in two Gospels, Matthew and Luke. The Q hypothesis invents a hypothetical or unproven gospel to explain the double tradition. It says that both Matthew and Luke were using this unproven gospel, which we call Q, and that's why Matthew and Luke have so much in common that isn't in Mark. However, there's another hypothesis called the Ferrer hypothesis, and this hypothesis says that Mark wrote his gospel first, and then Matthew wrote his gospel using the Gospel of Mark. Luke comes along, Luke has Matthew and Mark, and so Luke is copying out Mark, but then he notices that Matthew has a lot of material not in Mark, so he copies some of that material over as well. And so the Ferrer hypothesis does not appeal to any hypothetical documents, and it just says that Luke was using Matthew and Mark. Therefore, the Q hypothesis starts off being less probable than the fair hypothesis, since the fair hypothesis doesn't come up with any new hypothetical gospels or sources, whereas the Q hypothesis does. So scholars who believe in Q realize that if Matthew and Luke are not writing independently from each other, then there's no reason to believe in Q. This is because if Luke knew the Gospel of Matthew, then the double tradition could more simply be explained as Luke just copying down passages that are in Matthew but not in Mark. This is because Occam's razor says that the simplest explanation is best. Therefore, Q theorists have to argue that the authors of Luke and Matthew did not know the other person's Gospel. They had to be writing independently from one another. This is the only way to say that Q is therefore the best explanation. Only if Luke and Matthew definitely didn't know the other person's gospel, then the best explanation is that they must be getting it from another source that we just don't have anymore. But the second you say that one of them knows the other person's gospel, then there's no reason to appeal to an unknown source, because you can just say that one author is using the other. So if Matthew or Luke did know the other person's gospel, then Q instantly becomes an improbable theory. So the ultimate question when dealing with does Q exist, does Q not exist, the ultimate question becomes, did Luke know the Gospel of Matthew, or was Luke writing independently from Matthew? This is where the question of minor agreements comes into play. Minor agreements are instances in which Matthew and Luke change Mark in the exact same way. Remember that Mark is one of the sources of Matthew and Luke. It is a different source than the supposed Q. And so if Matthew and Luke change Mark in the exact same way, that would be good evidence that they are not writing independently of each other, but that one of them knows the other person's gospel. Therefore, if Matthew and Luke both make the same change to Mark, this would be good evidence that Luke did know Matthew's gospel and was therefore not writing independently from Matthew. These small changes in which Matthew and Luke agree against Mark are known as minor agreements because they are agreements that are small and they're agreements against Mark. So the next question becomes, are there minor agreements between Matthew and Luke? This is what we would expect if they are not writing independently from each other. If there's no Q, then we would expect minor agreements between Matthew and Luke. So are there minor agreements between Matthew and Luke? Well, actually, there are virtually no triple tradition pericopes without such agreements, according to Sanders and Davies. This means that almost every single passage that occurs in Matthew, Mark, and Luke has minor agreements in which Matthew and Luke agree with each other against Mark. While it's hard to come up with a precise count because scholars debate about what does and does not count as a minor agreement, probably the largest list of minor agreements comes from Richard B. Vinson, who counted 2,354 minor agreements between Matthew and Luke. Likewise, two scholars named Delbert Burkett and Werner Kahl have each separately concluded that there are just as many minor agreements between Matthew and Luke against Mark as there are minor agreements between Matthew and Mark against Luke, and minor agreements between Mark and Luke against Matthew. This gives very strong evidence that Matthew and Luke are not writing independently from each other, since they have just as many minor agreements with each other as the Gospels that we know are copying each other. There should be virtually no significant minor agreements between Matthew and Luke if they are writing independently, but instead there are just as many minor agreements as the Gospels that we know are not writing independently from each other. Now, so far, all of this evidence that I've given is mostly just theoretical, and I feel like it's hard to really grasp the thrust of the argument from minor agreements until you actually see some minor agreements for yourself. So that's what we're going to do for the rest of the video, is just take a look at some minor agreements and see if it seems like Luke is using Matthew or if they're both changing Mark independently from one another. Now remember, there are over 2,000 minor agreements, but we're only going to look at a handful, and the last two, in my opinion, are probably the strongest minor agreements demonstrating that Luke did not write independently from Matthew. But the first minor agreement we'll look at comes from Mark 12:22. Mark says, "Last of all, the woman died." But Matthew and Luke both changed the word last to later. The Greek word for later here is uncommon in the New Testament, but it is mostly used by Matthew. Therefore, it would be improbable that Matthew and Luke would have both independently changed the word last to later. It is more likely that Matthew made the change, and then Luke was using Matthew's gospel, and so he copied over the change. Another example comes from Mark 5:27, Mark says, she came up behind him in the crowd and touched his garment. This is a woman coming to Jesus and touching his garment to be healed. But Matthew and Luke both add that she touched the fringe of his garment. That's an unnecessary little detail that they both add in, and it's hard to imagine that they would both happen to add in the fringe independently, and so it makes sense if they are using each other's gospels. Also notice that Matthew and Luke both agree in leaving out the phrase in the crowd. See, Mark says she came up behind him in the crowd, but Matthew and Luke both delete that. So there's actually two minor agreements here, and it just seems improbable that they are both making these exact same changes independently from one another. Another example comes from Mark 2:3, and in Mark it says, and they came to him bringing a paralytic carried by 4. But Matthew and Luke both make some of the same changes. Matthew and Luke both add the word behold and behold. And they both add in the phrase upon a bed, that the man was upon a bed. These are all the exact same words in the Greek, in common between Matthew and Luke. And so it just seems improbable that they would both make those exact same changes independently from one another. And the most likely explanation is that Luke is using Matthew. Another example comes from Mark 2:12. And Mark says, and he rose and immediately picking up the pallet, he exited before all of them. But Matthew and Luke both add, he went into his house. Now, this is 5 consecutive words, not only in English, but also 5 consecutive words in Greek that are identical between Matthew and Luke, which aren't in Mark's version. Whenever you have a string of words like that all in a row, exactly the same between two sources, it just seems very improbable that that could be the result of them both independently changing Mark. This next one is one of the most famous minor agreements between Matthew and Luke against Mark. So in Mark it says, and some began to spit on him and to blindfold him and to beat him with their fists and to say to him, prophesy. Remember, this is when Jesus is being beaten before his crucifixion by the Roman soldiers. But Matthew and Luke both add in another string of 5 identical words in Greek, which is they say, prophesy, who is it that struck you? These are 5 consecutive words in a row in Greek that are identical. Now, one interesting thing is you could not say that maybe this is Q material, that maybe there is this saying in Q, the supposed lost gospel Q, in which it says, who is it that struck you? But the problem with that is that this is coming from the passion material, Jesus' crucifixion, death, resurrection. And if there's one thing that Q is very famous for, it's that it does not have Jesus' passion, his death, his resurrection, and therefore this cannot be coming from Q material. Also, there's no manuscript evidence that this is a minor agreement due to scribal changes. So you can't say that maybe a scribe copying the Gospel of Luke saw it in Matthew and then copied it down into Luke as well. Or you can't say that maybe Mark originally had it, but then a scribe accidentally left it off. And the reason you can't say that is because there is no manuscript evidence. There are no manuscripts in which it is added in to Mark, or no manuscripts that don't have it in Matthew or Luke. And so there's no manuscript evidence that this minor agreement is due to any scribal changes. Also, the word struck is a very uncommon word in Greek, and therefore this minor agreement isn't due to coincidence. They would have used a more familiar word than the word struck if they were writing independently from one another, but or at least they wouldn't have both chosen an uncommon word. What happened is Matthew added in the word struck, which is an uncommon word, and Luke copied it over, but the idea that they would both add in a sentence, both using uncommon vocabulary, strains credulity. That's why this is one of the most famous minor agreements in demonstrating that Luke and Matthew are not writing independently from one another. But this next one is actually my favorite minor agreement between Matthew and Luke. And it is a minor agreement in omission, meaning they both leave something out. Matthew and Luke do. So in Mark it says, just as it is written in Isaiah the prophet, behold, I am sending my messenger before you who will prepare your way. The voice of one calling out in the wilderness, prepare the way of the Lord, make his paths straight. Now notice that Matthew and Luke both remove the first part of that quotation. What are the chances that they would both remove the first part of the quotation independently from one another? Now you could argue that maybe they saw that the first quotation in Mark is not coming from Isaiah, but instead is coming from Malachi. So Mark says, just as it is written in Isaiah the prophet, and then he gives a quote from Malachi, and then a quote from Isaiah. So you could try to argue that they independently did this because they saw that as a problem, that he calls it a quote from Isaiah when it's coming from Malachi. But interestingly, they both add that quote back in to the exact same place in their Gospels. So it says, "But what did you go out to see? A prophet? Yes, I tell you, and one who's more than a prophet." So this is Jesus talking about John the Baptist. "This is the one about whom it is written, 'Behold, I am sending my messenger ahead of you who will prepare your way before you.'" So Matthew and Luke both take out this quotation from Mark and they move it to the exact same place later in their gospel. Now, this is pretty much impossible to have been done by chance. So what you would maybe have is somebody arguing that in the lower table, we are looking at Q material. So maybe Q had this quotation in it as well. Matthew and Luke both knew that Q had it, and therefore Matthew and Luke both left it out the first time it's mentioned, and then later they kept it in the Q material, and that's why they both delete it earlier, and then they both have it in the same place later on. So this would be one attempt at explaining this minor agreement under the Q hypothesis. But there's a problem with that. And the problem is that this is not coming from Q material. This is actually quoting the Gospel of Mark. When Mark quoted Malachi 3:1, Mark actually changed Malachi a little bit. And in Matthew and Luke, when they quote the same passage later on in their Gospels, they are quoting it exactly the same way that Mark did. Let me show you. So in Malachi 3:1, it says, "He will clear a way before me." But Mark adds in two words, "will prepare," and "your way." Neither of these words are in the Malachi passage, either in the Septuagint or the Masoretic text. It's not there in any of the Old Testament versions. So Mark made a change, and Matthew and Luke have the exact same change when they quote that passage later on. So Matthew and Luke's versions of this quotation do not come from any known version of the Old Testament. Instead, Matthew and Luke are clearly quoting from the Gospel of Mark's version of the Old Testament quotation. Therefore, this quotation in Matthew and Luke is not coming from Q material, because Q didn't know the Gospel of Mark, and Mark didn't know the Gospel of Q, if Q actually existed. That's what Q theorists say. They didn't know each other. So this could not be coming from Q material. Q couldn't have quoted the Gospel of Mark. But instead, Matthew and Luke are clearly quoting the Gospel of Mark. This means that under the Q hypothesis, Matthew and Luke independently took part of an Old Testament quotation in Mark and moved it to the exact same place later in their Gospels. And by the way, I'm getting all of this information from Mark Goodacre's article, "The Evangelist's Use of the Old Testament in the Synoptic Problem." So clearly, this strains credulity to say that they both could have made such a major change independently from one another. It seems impossible. And so to me, the most logical explanation is that there was no hypothetical source Q. Matthew and Luke aren't writing independently from one another, but instead Luke is copying from both the Gospel of Mark and the Gospel of Matthew. So some Q theorists ask the question, if Luke knew the Gospel of Matthew, why does Luke not copy in any of the stories that Matthew added to Mark? Why do we only have minor agreements but not any major agreements or major stories that Matthew added to Mark? Why does Luke not copy any of those in? But the obvious answer is he did. And this is the double tradition material that we call Q. Luke copied in 230 verses that Matthew added to Mark, and that's why these verses are just between Matthew and Luke. And this is what is known as the double tradition material that Q theorists think is Q. But another question they might ask is, well, why does Luke, in the non-Q material, in the Mark material, why does Luke not copy in any of the big changes that Matthew makes to Mark's material? So I'm not talking about a story that's just in Matthew, a story that Matthew adds to Mark. I'm talking about when Matthew edits a story that is in Mark and maybe adds a lot to it. Why does Luke only copy the minor changes, making minor agreements? Why are there no major agreements between Matthew and Luke against Mark? But again, there are plenty of these. I'm going to give you 3 examples. The first one comes from John the Baptist's teaching. So all of the material that is highlighted is Matthew and Luke's major agreement against Mark. So Mark had a shortened version of the story. Matthew added in a lot more material, and Luke copied that material over. So that would be a major agreement between Matthew and Luke against Mark. Another agreement comes from Jesus' temptation. I'm sure you know the story of the temptation. In Mark, it's actually very short. Immediately, the Spirit brought him into the wilderness, and he was in the wilderness for 40 days being tempted by Satan, and he was with wild animals, and the angels were serving him. That's Mark's whole story. But the long story comes from Matthew and Luke. And so this would be a major agreement against Mark. And so under the Pharaoh hypothesis, Matthew added in this material and Luke copied it over. A third example comes from when the Pharisees asked Jesus for a sign. Mark just says, and the Pharisees came out and began to argue with him, demanding from him a sign from heaven to test him. Sighing deeply in his spirit, he said, "Why does this generation demand a sign? Truly I say to you, no sign will be given to this generation." That's the end of sentence. Matthew and Luke both go on, though, except for the sign of Jonah. And then they both explain that, and then they talk about the Queen of Sheba. So this would be another major agreement in Matthew and Luke against Mark. There are a handful of other examples that I'm not going to go through in this video. I just want to show that there are also major agreements against Mark. But the reason that in the Pharaoh hypothesis we don't harp on these major agreements is because Q theorists just call this material Mark-Q overlap. What they say is that Mark and Q had the exact same story, and Q had a longer version of it. And so Matthew and Luke both add in the Q material to Mark. And so that's kind of how they get around the major agreements. But the minor agreements are what are really problematic for the Q hypothesis, because it's, in my opinion, it's impossible to explain how you could have over 2,000 minor agreements where Matthew and Luke make the same changes to Mark, and it's clearly not coming from Q material. And if anyone says, why are there no major agreements against Mark? Why are there only minor agreements? Well, this is evidence that there clearly are major agreements, just like we would expect if Matthew added material to Mark and then Luke copied that material over. Thank you so much for watching this video. Again, remember to subscribe so that you don't miss future content, and I will catch you in the next video.